Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to another episode of In the Clouds with Red Hat Leadership here on Openshift TV. We're joined by Ashesh Badani, Senior Vice President of Cloud Platforms here at Red Hat. I'm Chris Short, Principal Technical Marketing Manager and Executive Producer of Openshift TV here at Red Hat. I'm very excited to have Ashesh here. Ashesh, please introduce yourself to the audience. Let everybody know what you've been up to the past few months too, please.
Cool. Hey, Chris, and hello to everyone else who's on here. My name is Ashesh Badani. As Chris said, I'm responsible for cloud platforms at Red Hat, which covers our OpenShift set of technologies, OpenStack, virtualization, both existing virtualization as well as the work we're doing on next generation container-native virtualization. And also our developer tools. So I'm excited and I'm honored. So thank you, Chris, for the opportunity to come and speak with you.
Well, thank you for joining us. Couldn't ask for a better guest, to be honest with you, right after KubeCon too. So it's even better, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But so I've done a few of these interviews now, and one thing I've kind of learned is, especially since working at Red Hat, is that it's very rare that someone is coming to Red Hat having never heard or worked with the products before. What was your first introduction to Red Hat?
Yeah, interesting you say that, right? Because I used to work at Sun Microsystems, before I got over to Red Hat. All through, if you will, sort of college into my, time at Sun, Sun Labs, Solaris, Sun workstations. I mean, that was the thing, right? It was hard to get time from, unleash the most amount of power that you could see. And there's a lot of innovation, right, happening in Solaris at the time, right? So right. You're talking about zones in Solaris. So it's funny we talk about containers. I'm sure we'll come around to that, right? Zones in Solaris. dtrace, ZFS, just a whole host of stuff, right? So, kind of interacting with Linux, and then so Red Hat was almost like, what is this, right? And why is this showing up? And why is this popular in financial services when, I think at Sun, I'm sorry, I'm being sort of completely casual here, right? I'm still going to treat this as just, totally fine. It was almost like, financial service was some of the biggest customers. Financial service and telcos, right? I would say were the biggest customers for Sun. And it was almost like we are running at huge scale, right? Obviously, Sun was very focused on loading up these boxes, right? They were called like E10K and E15Ks.
Yeah.
And right, running like massive server farms there, right? And look, this is the time of the vertical scale out, right? Not the horizontal scale out. And
absolutely,
and thinking about this Tinker toy, so showing up. Like how would this ever sort of, anyway, I'll stop there, right? So my introduction to sort of Linux almost sort of came from that perspective of looking at Solaris's path, comparing to Linux, and then sort of Red Hat Linux showing up, and there was a whole transition then that happened within the company as well,
right?
Which got I think even got Sun very comfortable with Linux. But one thing I'll pause to say, right, is, when I came to Red Hat from Sun, the thing I liked a lot, it's sort of, Sun, felt like home to me, and coming to Red Hat also was coming home to me. Mostly because the cultures of both companies, were so similar, right? This sort of commitment to openness, wanting to drive innovation, collegiality, meritocracy, sort of a free exchange of ideas. I mean, all of that, I saw and loved at Sun. And, I see the same at Red Hat too, right? So, anyway, long answer to your short question.
No, that's great. And it's interesting that you mentioned things like dtrace and ZFS, because those things are coming or are in Linux, or have been ported over now, right? So it shows you how powerful Sun was, that we're bringing some of that tooling and some of that storage capability forward, right? Like, so Sun did some amazing things, and Solaris brought I mean, I remember running this old Solaris box, and it was huge, right? Like it's like a boat anchor, but it was actually connected over ATM, right? Like the old fiber links.
Yeah.
And it was just a beast, and you could do anything on this thing at the time. This was the early 2000s, and it was just like if we had any network problem that I needed to troubleshoot, it had a tool for it on that box, and
And
off I
once
could
you
go.
turn it on, it's on, right? I mean,
Yeah,
I remember meeting customers who said, I haven't done a restart on this thing for. He's like, I don't even know the last time I did it, right? Must have been
right,
like a couple of years ago,
right.
right? So that, if you will, all of those kind of characteristics, you know, I think maybe there was a point of time, right, where sort of the power of open really shone through, right? So on the one hand, you could argue that, Sun recognized that with the work you did in Java,
Mm-hmm.
but it didn't see that happening, with Linux, right? And how
Right.
you start something up, you have a community that builds on it, right? And you've got this collaboration that sort of takes place. Sun's doing it with Java, but it's not doing it, if you will, in its core business. And you know, what do I mean? In the business press, they call this the innovator's dilemma, right? That sort of
Right.
strikes a company, right? So Java was the new space for it. So it was, obviously greenfield. Feel free to kind of, work,
Mm-hmm.
via, what James Gosling is driving. But here, it's an existing business, right? With this, huge, if you will, installed base that I think the company it took a long time, right? And in fact, obviously never managed to completely get out of that.
Yeah, I mean, the Oracle acquisition did do some things to Sun that we're still seeing the aftermath, or I guess the after effects of today, right? Um, so let's switch gears a little bit, right? Like OpenShift 4.6 was just released. We've come a long way from OpenShift 4, the original announcement at Summit last year. So, and even longer since the early days of OpenShift with cartridges and so forth. What do you think are the most important achievements over those years that have led to OpenShift's success?
Yeah, so I started running the OpenShift group in 2012.
Mm.
Which in
Yeah.
span of time is 8 years. Feels like dog's years, right?
Yeah. Nowadays.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, especially now, right? The last year sort of been, I don't know, factorial in the dog
It's
years.
March 275th, I think.
So while I might not look super old, I am. But when we started OpenShift, there was a big push towards, for lack of a better term, I'll just call it public cloud paths, and I'll tell you what I mean by that, right? You probably remember this, Chris. Azure started off in that sort of PaaS space, right?
Mm-hmm.
Azure, started there, and then I think started recognizing, hey, there's a lot of investment to be done, money to be made on infrastructure primitives, right? And sort of start focusing on the IaaS piece a lot. You had Google App Engine, right? That was really active in that time.
Yes.
I guess one of the flag bearers in that space at the time was Heroku, right? Which you can argue, right? Really focused amazingly on the developer experience, and there's still much to learn, right, from the work that Heroku did. And so when OpenShift started that time, right, there was a lot of sorry to describe it. There's a lot of interest in saying, let's just go squarely at that space. And as I came on board, we made a decision within the team to say, we believe that there's an opportunity to take that platform, which we stood up and we were running, and at the time we were running OpenShift Online for thousands of developers, right?
Yeah.
All these apps sort of being built on it. Really
I
getting
used
exposed
it.
to.
Yeah.
You used it then, yeah. I mean.
Yeah.
And then we said we're going to focus on starting to see if we can actually get on-premise and an OpenShift experience on-premise, right? So that, if you will, was sort of the first inflection point for us to say, there's an opportunity for online, but we believe there's an opportunity to get this technology out in front of customers, right? So we pushed that pretty hard. Started getting some customers and some early successes. That was around the time Cloud Foundry sort of came along as well, and there was this whole thing made up, the OpenShift or Cloud Foundry or some other alternative out there. Regardless of what each one of us was doing, right, it became pretty clear to us in the OpenShift team that if there's no standardization or portability here, this is going to be hard. to get the trajectory that you want, right? Because if people are like, look, I need an Amazon machine image here and VMDK here and some of the format that OpenShift's come up with on this side, and then Heroku's got build packs on that side, and someone's modifying all of this stuff, right? No one's really going to commit to saying, I'm going to adopt this as my platform for my entire set of infrastructure and application that I have. And so we made the pivot to Docker and then ultimately to Kubernetes at that time, right? Which, I tell people all the time that in hindsight, seems like such an obvious decision, right? At the time we made it, was not obvious at all.
Right.
When we, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I was about to say, when you made the switch, right? Like that was a gamble, right? Like, for lack of a better term, right? Like we had no idea if that was going to work.
Exactly right, Chris. Right. So, by the way, when did you join Red Hat, Chris? What was that?
2.5 years ago. So recently.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. But you were able to see that from the outside. So that quarter, right, that we had when we were still shipping OpenShift, the sort of, if you will, the last part of the version 2, and we're sort of preparing version 3. We actually actively started telling customers who are on version 2 that there is really no future path for this. We're doing a complete architectural change, right? You're going to have to switch. Those were really difficult conversations, right, to be had, right? No customer likes to be told, hey, you just sort of essentially a dead ending on this path, we're going to move you over. That quarter was probably one of the worst quarters from a performance perspective that we had, and then we knowingly took that hit. Yeah. Right. And if that gamble, right, to use the term that you used there, hadn't paid off, right, you and I wouldn't be here today having this conversation.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And like I went through the transition, right? Like it was some pain, but we were fine. We came out the other end okay. It's one of those things where sometimes when you have to like embrace a sea change, essentially, there's going to be like, you can't make an egg without breaking omelets, right? Like you're not going to be able to just completely shift paths onto essentially Kubernetes and containers and that route, as opposed to gears and cartridges, right? Like it's custom, quasi proprietary kind of setup versus, hey, more ubiquitous and more user friendly. Well, not at the time user friendly, but becoming more user friendly, more universal, I think, which drives home the hybrid cloud message that we're pushing right now, right? Like Kubernetes gives you hybrid cloud capabilities that you never had before.
Yeah, the if you will, the technology bet, on the one hand was an all-out bet, but it was based on things that we knew, right? I mean, we were still, when we had the earliest version of OpenShift, right, it's still based on containers, right? Linux containers, right? With taking a Linux instance and slicing it up, right, and using C groups and namespaces and essentially partitioning them. I mean, this is the same idea, right, that we carried forward into Docker, right? And of course, to your point, right, better on the standardization, better on the user experience, and a whole bunch of other improvements that took place. And maybe even more importantly was acceptance of that, right, amongst an ecosystem. And I think that may have been maybe the singularly biggest sort of achievement, right, that came out of that, right? And you've been in the business a long time, Chris. To see a technology get adopted as fast as Docker did by almost everybody, right? I mean, whether it's us or it was IBM then, or VMware, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, obviously. I mean, everyone's sort of going off and agreeing to something. I mean, that is rare, right? And
it's
so
very rare, incredibly rare. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I've only seen it a handful of times in my life. Right. And I've been in tech since I was 15. So
yeah.
I
mean, the closest thing you can imagine, I mean, that I can think of is Java, but even Java, right? You still have, Microsoft is sort of a big holdout on that, but this one, right? There's widespread acceptance and adoption. So that's incredible.
Yeah. And, and fast forwarding to today, yesterday, I'm a CNCF ambassador, right? So yesterday was a challenging day for us, the CNCF ambassadors, because, we're getting ready to release Kubernetes 1.20, the next version of Kubernetes. And the Kubernetes community, the Kubernetes team is deprecating like Docker support. And that kind of scares people, but people don't realize that Docker's a company, Docker is a software stack, Docker's a file format. It's all these things that are just put under this one term. And it scared people that we said we were deprecating things. I mean, what do you want to say to folks about the upcoming deprecation in Kubernetes of Docker, right? Like it'll be fully out in 1.21, which should be out the next quarter. And 1.20, I think, is dropping on Monday, if I remember correctly. So what do you want to say to folks that are concerned about Docker deprecation in Kubernetes?
Yeah, so Chris, you have been talking about this a little bit, right? So look, sometimes this happens to us all the time, right? Mm-hmm. When you're so deep into something, you just assume that it's going to come out, it's going to be a non-issue because within, if you will, the people who live in and breathe in the community, they've been talking about it for weeks, months at this point.
Yeah.
So it doesn't feel as big, but people whose day job isn't to sort of watch every change in Kubernetes every week, they're kind of like, what the hell happened here, right?
Right. It was a big shock. That,
yeah, exactly, right. And so one, no one should feel like anyone try to pull a fast one on them, other than the fact that the community obviously spends a lot of time moving on new ideas and working on them, and it's hard to sometimes keep up, right? So kudos to you, Chris, and to the rest of the CNCF ambassadors, right? Doing a sort of great job. And I forget the name of the lady who's been, sort of tweeting this out. I think I retweeted this, right? About, just trying to explain this in just simple layperson's terms, mm-hmm. right? With regard to, what's taking place. To your point, Chris, right? One, there's confusion on, Docker, the image format, Docker, the runtime, Docker, the company, Docker, the experience. I mean, all of these things sort of seem to conflate together. Mm-hmm. But a simple analogy that I like to think of and use, right, is a little bit like, when Chris and I talk about this as well, right, is with PDFs, right? So you've got a PDF and you can choose to view a PDF on an Adobe Acrobat reader, or you can use the reader that, is available to you on your Mac.
Right. And
it's still the same PDF.
Yep.
Use that. And I'm sure there's, I'm sure there's a whole bunch of other tools to view PDFs, right? The PDF still exists. It's as is, right? Mm-hmm. It works as well with your, reader on your Windows machine as it does, on your Mac. But if you're on the Mac, you don't feel compelled to say, well, I must have the Adobe Acrobat reader to be able to view it, right?
Right.
I'd say this is almost analogous, right? Your images, they're in, they're Docker containers, they're, following the OCI mm-hmm. Guidelines, specifications, what have you, right? And then you just choose a runtime to actually run it. And, you've got a bunch of options that you can take advantage of the market. We've got cryo in place for a while for exactly this, change that was coming up. And I don't think anything else sort of changes, right? But I think there's a little bit of almost this emotional reaction, I think, that's taken place, right?
Part of it is, yeah.
Right, because it's almost like, well, we got to this Kubernetes place and we started from the Docker place, and now the Docker place seems to be taken away, and oh my gosh, is the world coming to an end for real this time?
Yeah, no, it's not, right? Like it's going to be okay, folks. There's a lot of different OCI compliant runtimes out there. And for example, we've been using Cryo and Openshift for a long time. A lot of customers are using it. It works great, right? Like the way you build your containers, the way you build those images, and how you consume them can be different, right? Like correct. You can build with Docker and consume with Kubernetes fine, as long as it's an OCI compliant image, right? And I think that's the beauty of Kubernetes, is that you have all these different compliant images. You have Kata, you've got Run C, you got C Run, and they all do different things. They all have these special capabilities, micro VMs kind of thing. And that is the strength of a large open community, is to get all these things in here and to get customers engaged and happy with the experience they're having. And yes, Docker deprecation might change some things for you in the long run, but it's time, right? Like we need a fully OCI compliant spec to be the standard inside Kubernetes, right? And having all these shims in place and everything else that are hard to maintain or falling off the maintainership path, it's time to kind of make the switch, right? And the Kubernetes community decided to deprecate it in this release, right? You'll get a warning, and then the next release it's going to be gone. And I understand that's pretty quick, right? Like 6 months essentially from deprecation notice to end of times. But this has been in the works for a while, and a lot of people I feel were shocked, like you said, emotionally, because they've made such an enormous investment in themselves to learn Docker and to understand how containers work, not necessarily the container runtimes, right? Like they went down one path without realizing there were others, right? And I think that's why there's this shock out there, which is fine. You have every right to be concerned. But we're here to tell you you're going to be okay, I think is kind of the big takeaway.
I agree 100%. Chris. So awesome. I think the more we do on the education front, right, it's bachelor, it's documentation, it's, answering questions in forums. I'm sure it's going to come up in Stack Overflow. I'm sure it's going to come up in a bunch of different places, right? Reddit threads are going to get set up on this, right? We just, as long as we keep addressing it.
Yeah. And then this, I thought, this came to me literally right before we came on the air to ask you about this. And I think it's that important that we discussed it today because of all the work that's been going into it from all the other CNCF ambassadors, right? The Kubernetes blog had like 9 contributors yesterday to explain this process and how it's going to work in the long term. And, Jeff Geerling over on the management side's got a video he put out about it. And it's just education time, right? And so we're going to amp that up over the next couple of weeks and months so that folks understand what they're doing and, the underneath parts that Docker kind of hid away now need to kind of be understood a little bit better. And that's our objective for, asking the question essentially.
Well, the main question, Chris, is, has it gotten to top 5 on Hacker News?
Oh, I'm sure it has. I'm sure it has.
We're really going to work on this.
I mean, to your point earlier, where everything was Docker for a few years, right? Like, I'm sure it's gotten to the top of Hacker News. It has made its rounds, and I've gotten questions on Twitter, so I know it's definitely out there. Switching gears here, how does leadership change in this new cloud native era that we've entered?
Wow. Well, 1, that's really switching gears. And then 2, that's a broad question. So
really hard transition. Sorry about that.
Here we are. You got the fire in the background. You got a cup of coffee, right? Waiting for you to pull out your pipe. How does leadership change? Tell me where you want to go with that.
Well, I mean, so right, like it used to be that leaders would say, "Hey, I need you to set up enough capacity to do X, Y, and Z." And now there's all kinds of ways to do that. And do you be more prescriptive? Do you be less prescriptive and let your developers kind of choose their own tooling, right? Like when I think about, some of my ops positions in the, 20 teens or whatever, I think about, VMs and how hard it was to get a VM and how long it took. And now it's like, if I have my own namespace, I can create as many containers as I want up to, any threshold that's been in, any quota that's been put in place. So the leadership changes that need to happen in a cloud native era are a lot around culture. I think, right? Because we have things like GitOps where, everything that lives in Git, it's a declarative kind of state. It's a process that actually kind of implements DevOps for you without you knowing. So those culture changes, I feel like, are going to be more people-based and technology-based. So that's where I think leadership comes in and kind of has to guide folks and say, open your mind up to new things. Back to the Docker conversation. So, how would you encourage leaders to think in this cloud native era? I guess might be the better question.
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So let me see how we break that down. The first thing I'll start with is empathy, right? Because you talked a little bit about culture, and I think before you even get to culture, just this notion of dealing with the amount of change that people are going through, I think just requires us to show more empathy, right, to each other. And I'm not saying we weren't doing it before,
right?
But I think we need, as a community, just as humans, even, right, to do that. Look, in the U.S., we just went through Thanksgiving, and these are tough times for a lot of people. Yeah. But for a lot of us, there's much to be thankful about, right? We work in roles, a lot of us do, where we are in some sense relatively shielded from much that goes on, right? We can, for the most part, work remotely. There's many others who are putting themselves out, at harm's way.
Yes.
Things. There are many others who are struggling. Like, for example, and I don't know if this is the case for you, Chris, right? But we've got folks, let's say, within the company where there's two parents who are both working, and they have 2 kids under the age of 4.
Right.
Now, some places in the US, some places in the world, some childcare has opened up. In many other places it hasn't. So how are those 2 people supposed to kind of get through this time, right? So even before we get to VMs and containers and all of that, it's just like, how do you support, or make sure that you're able to support people who perhaps come up to you and say, hey, can I work, whatever, 8 to 12 while my wife takes, care of the 2 little ones, and then she'll switch over, and then I'll come back around at night. And, how do you kind of balance that? So, so it's a long way for me to say, look, there's a lot to sort of just be said with regard to, provide enough empathy, provide enough flexibility, provide enough opportunity for people to kind of, address all these sort of changes that we're going through. Now, good news, perhaps, this vaccine comes out, is super effective, rolled out at scale, and, life kind of, starts resembling more like what it used to be in the before times.
Right.
But we still have some time to go, through that.
Yeah, I bought masks yesterday. Yeah. I mean, there's still going to be a while to go, right? Like we're refreshing our mask stock, if that gives you any idea, right?
Right.
There's a long way to go with COVID, but
it's the darkest before dawn. At least that's what I sort of like to think about, right? And it feels like, at least in the US, we're seemingly at a second wave now with hospitalizations and so on at the sort of back to the March levels, right? So we're coming to the holidays now again, right? We're coming into, big parts of the US that are going to run into winters, and people are going to be in close quarters again. So anyway, there's leadership, right? That I think each one of us, right, regardless of position, role, whatever you do, right, that we've all got to show there's the ability to sort of, be mindful of kind of what other people are going through. And then that leads, I think, to culture. Right, so this notion of that you're talking about, right, with regard to, are we culturally ready for all these changes that have taken place, right? So in the case of a company like Red Hat, used to working remotely, right? So was this a little bit harder for us than it used to be before? Yes, right. Certain things, right? We used some in-person meetings, and so on, right? Certain parts of our company that perhaps needed to go in the office a little bit more. Yes, but just culturally, I think we as a company are pretty comfortable with distributed teams, people working from wherever, how you kind of interact with them, collaborate with them, and so on. I think there's a lot that's kind of going on with other companies that maybe they aren't in the same place, right? So they are almost being forced to embrace this transformation, maybe even faster than they would have liked, right? And so there's goodness, right? And then there's some, what's the right term, right? It's
forced. Forced to change, forced to embrace kind of thing,
Yeah, right. And so the reason I bring that up is so I was talking to some industry analysts, and I said, look, we as a group are already starting to talk about GitOps, and there are people that haven't fully kind of gone through the DevOps cycle yet.
Right.
Right. And so sometimes we forget, right? So this maybe relates to something else that we talk about, Chris, a lot within our group, right? Which is, on the one hand, you've got groups of customers, right, that are like, hey, get me the next release as fast as possible and keep me moving.
Yeah.
And then there are other customers that are on release versions, right, that are like, whatever, right, 6 versions, at least, right, behind. And you're trying to sort of help them, move along, and they've got a whole host of reasons why they can't, or why it'll take them time to do it. And so I feel like, we're constantly caught and kind of have to live within these two worlds, right? On the one hand, right, we're talking about DevOps, now we're starting to talk about GitOps, trying to get people to understand why that's valuable, and tools we start providing on that front. And on the other hand, you've got this whole host of, folks who are forcibly, to your point, Chris, right, almost sort of going through this cultural change and are just now embracing, hey, here's what DevOps, here's what kind of this new way of working can bring to us.
Yeah, I think back to some of the positions I held when, right, like we had a snowstorm and everybody had to work from home. And then all of a sudden the VPN was so saturated, nobody could work from home, right? Like I think about situations like that when all this started, it was just like, how many organizations are going to be in that position, and I imagine it was a lot of them. And then all of a sudden they had to flip a whole lot of gears and bring in a whole lot of different services that they'd never used before to make work. And I think we're part of that, right? Like a lot of the services that are out there being used to kind of fill the void run on Kubernetes and OpenShift. And there's that change. I think if you're embracing GitOps, you're kind of, without saying it, you're embracing DevOps. But like to your point, right? Like GitOps has been a term since like 2018, 2017, and we're just now like getting the tooling around it, right? Like to where it's like a good cohesive kind of practice or process that you can just put into place. That's wild, right? Like 2 or 3 years to get everything kind of fully going around a process. The same thing happened with DevOps, right? We're now 10, 11 years into the DevOps phraseology, evolution, whatever you want to call it. And we still see some people that are, doing things with VMs and kind of the old stodgy way, potentially. There's nothing wrong with that if that's what works for you, right? Like there's regulatory reasons that you have to do certain things. But then there's the new, kind of Kubernetes world of containers and operating quickly. And there was, a report last year that said the lifetime of like 74% of containers was less than 30 seconds. I mean, that's almost serverless, right? At that point, right? It's pretty wild to think about that, right? Like how would you like to spend 6 months waiting to get a VM and then in 7 seconds it's gone, right? Like you can't operate like that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to bring this up, right? Because this brings up a thing that comes up for me oftentimes in customer conversations, right? So, we launched Openshift 4, and we've been trying to push pretty hard with regard to here's the value of over-the-air upgrades and how this can help benefit you. And we went through a lot of pain, and our customers went through a whole bunch of dealing with challenges around upgrade cycles and how to kind of manage that. And we learned from that, which is why we did all the things we did in 4. Having said that, right, this behavior change, cultural change that people have to go through, right, is so real, because there is still some amount of I get it, but there's still trepidation to allow for you to have clusters that can upgrade like that, right? So I'm sure all of us kind of went through this a little bit, right, with regard to when you had your phones and you're like, oh man, this phone's going to upgrade and things are going to go nuts. Or if you drive an electric car, right, it's like, oh my gosh, do I really want an upgrade cycle here, man? This thing, if this breaks out, I'm stuck. Right? So I get some of that, but at the same time, what I find is the expectations for upgrades are different when they're using public cloud services, right? And so people think, hey, it's okay, that upgrade's pretty quick, and they're accepting of that. But there's almost kind of a mindset sort of change that needs to happen on what people would consider traditional enterprise software.
Right.
say, because it's almost like allow yourself to believe that what you call enterprise software, right, can work in a fashion that's more analogous to public cloud than it has been before. And once we kind of get there, right, then I think, embracing other things as well becomes easier. Operators, right, another great example of that, right, which is, in the past, you're so used to saying, I have, X, Y, and Z other third-party apps from ISVs. To manage them, to monitor them, right? I've got, teams of folks to do that.
Right.
And then, we come along, right, and say, well, the community is, sort of proposing this way to say, well, maybe not 100% of it, but a whole bunch of, that kind of rote work, right, can now be done by the platform. And that's all automated. And by the way, that's awesome for you, because now these folks can all work on either the newer technologies you wanted to work on or whatever else, right? That
they can tackle harder problems that only humans can. Yeah, exactly.
Right, exactly, right? Unleash their creativity, right? Their interest in driving it, and let this kind of stuff be taken care of by this distributed system that's starting to get some honor. And there's a lot of kind of, there's a, embracing that even, right? Again, is going back to your earlier point, Chris. It's the cultural sort of behavior change, right? That we need to go through. I get it, and especially at this time, people don't want super amounts of change. They're like, man, there's enough change happening in my life.
Right, exactly.
But it's inevitable. I don't know if
I think the best way to put it is that our notion of safety has to change when it comes to software, right? Like we're always taught, like, go slower, slow down, be safer, right? Use the handrail, that kind of thing, right? Where nowadays, the faster you move, the more secure, the more stable things will become, because you have to build things into your system to find those errors on the fly, because you're not going to be able to detect things by human anymore, right? Like that human's not going to be able to sit there and be like, oh, API call failed. Let me patch that real quick. No, you got to have a system that's going to test all those. And you've got to have a pipeline of sorts to build, deploy, and, maintain your infrastructure and your software. And that's where I think a lot of people kind of, need to embrace that idea of safety change, where speed is safety when it comes to software and compute, and just, the internet in general. So that's my take on that. KubeCon just happened, right? Like we just had Thanksgiving. KubeCon was right before that. Did you have any takeaways from KubeCon, right? Like I know a lot of people, talking, is it really GitOps if some of it's in Git and some of it isn't? Like there's that conversation going, and then there's, several conversations about, oh, cloud native storage, what should we do, kind of deal, right? And that world's kind of solidifying, I feel like, and there's a lot going on, right? Like I printed off the CNCF landscape this morning just to give people an idea, right? Like there's a lot going on in the ecosystem. So what did you notice at KubeCon this year?
Well, it's funny you bring up the CNCF chart. I bring that up a lot of times, right? When I have conversations, I'm like,
exactly.
Look, guys, we live and breathe this. We're in this every day. We can barely keep up.
Right.
How are you supposed to keep up? And why do you even want to keep up, right? So I think there's that, one of the themes that I feel is starting to get very important is the maturation, right? That we've kind of got to get through, right? There's a lot of innovation that's happening, which is fantastic. The question is, how does that innovation, become more consumable, become more manageable, over a period of time, right? So we talked about this, people are on older versions and how do you upgrade it? We talked a little bit about the skills are required and the behavior change, right? You were used to working a certain way, you're figuring out DevOps, now GitOps is showing up.
Right.
Serverless, right? It's like, okay, do I embrace that? Right? How do I do that? People talking about this sort of hybrid, multi-cloud sort of, notion, right? Take advantage of running these different environments. We as a group have been pushing pretty hard on being able to offer the same platform in a managed fashion as well, in a bunch of different environments, right? So, run it at scale yourself, or have us, manage it directly, or on behalf of, in partnership with the cloud provider to sort of give you the same platform, same abstraction, regardless of what infrastructure you choose. Edge has become an interesting area for us, right? Lots of customer interest on
It's
that
become
front,
very
right?
real. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, uh, you can argue at this point, and telcos is a good one because they're sort of making this shift pretty hard, right? You can almost kind of see the generations that have been evolving on the telco front, right? Going from sort of a hardware-based environment to say, hey, look, we are going to become much more software-defined.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can argue 4G was all sort of VM based, right? And say, look, how can I virtualize my capabilities, run the network functions increasingly as virtual machines, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now increasingly for 5G, for the most part, we're seeing telcos wanting to do that in a containerized or cloud native fashion. And that's pretty real, right? Across the board, right? We see it in North America, but also in Europe, as well as carriers in Asia that are pushing pretty hard, right? So there's a huge change that's happening on that front with regard to what they're running, if you will, in their core, what they're putting out the edge. Definitions of edge, right, is
Oh,
fascinating,
yeah. Yeah.
right? It's like,
Everybody has a different
yeah,
definition, it seems.
right.
Yeah.
So what's an edge to me? Maybe not an edge like to you, and then for you, an edge literally is, I don't know, a Nest thermostat, right, running in your
Right.
house,
Yeah.
right? So where do you kind of draw the line, and what kind of capabilities will you require on each of those, right? What are the constraints, if you will, that you need to deal with?
Mm-hmm.
How do you manage those environments that are running, right? So I think that's an area of interest and focus, I think, for us at Red Hat, but also just in general, I think within the Kubernetes community. That's interesting. And then another one, and then I'll get to the final one, which I think is almost sort of the most controversial one.
Mm.
Another one is just developer experience,
Oh, yeah.
right? So Chris, you flashed up the CNCF chart, right?
Mm.
How do you actually use?
Yeah. How do you go about consuming all these things?
Right, and it's almost to the point where the platform is not the end goal in itself, right?
Mm-mm.
It's what can you build with that platform or run better or deploy better or get greater value from. That's the reason why you have this flexible environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so focusing very heavily on kind of how we make it easier for folks to, you talk about pipelines, or how we make it easier for folks to actually be able to use these applications, use these different services that are coming up from cloud providers or others out in the marketplace. I think that's really important, right? We're spending a lot of time, as you know, Chris, investing in that area.
Well, it's funny. I think a lot of people don't realize how, like, the switch from 4 to 5G, like, you actually have to have more sites, more cell sites broadcasting signal out there, right? But those cell sites are actually kind of smaller, right? As well, right? Like, I remember seeing like a portable 4G antenna at a sporting event once, and it was like 2 trailers worth of stuff because you had a generator and then you had the actual like cell thing with the tower sticking out of it and all this stuff, right? Now you can almost do that in a box, right? Like human carryable to an extent, which is amazing. But that just tells you the dramatic change that has to happen in software, because you can't have 16 CPUs in that little box and thing's going to overheat, right? Like you got limited compute, you got limited storage. There's a finite amount of capacity you have on all your edge devices out there. And, like you said, for me, I've got a lot of edge devices. My car is an edge device. It gets updates while it sits in my garage. It's a Ford, right? It's not a Tesla. It's not anything special. It's a Ford. I live in Detroit, so it gets over-the-air updates just like Openshift would, right? So the idea of, like, I think the iPhone itself has kind of turned everything in like on its head as far as what people want to experience with software, right? They want auto updating. They want it to just work, right? They don't want to spend times banging their head against, a platform or trying to build that platform themselves. They're in the business to do something else. And that's where the cloud providers and we and IBM come in, where it's, we can give you solutions tailored to your use case very well. And our customers get the benefit of that. And then, we often share our learnings in the product itself.
Yeah, Chris, you truly know the platform is successful if it's invisible.
Bingo.
Right.
Yeah. If you don't see it, you don't have to interact with it.
Right. And so then that allows for you to focus on all the other things, right? Because if it's not invisible, that means you're dealing with it in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're dealing with it, that's taking time away from you. That's taking resource away from you, from doing all the things that really the platform needs to enable. Right. And sometimes I feel like we get so caught up in trying to, have the platform stand out. It's like, no, really, everything you build around it is the thing that really will matter.
Yeah.
Right. For people.
And I was reading an article, I was talking to some of the original Kate's creators, and like they all thought, Kate should be access to an abstraction layer, right? Some other API that you would talk to like actually talk to the clusters themselves. And that's where we need to move, right? Where everything is kind of protected by an API, and there's, good, system call, security around that. And that's how your developers should work, right? They should just simply talk to APIs the way they are used to, not talking to databases directly or talking to, web servers or, Java servers directly, right? Like they should be talking to APIs. And that's where the developer experience, I think, improves with Kubernetes if you build or have the platform that works as well as an Openshift does, for example. Not to plug our product, but it is a very good product in my opinion. I mean, I work at Red Hat because I think Openshift is the best Kubernetes platform. So I wouldn't work anywhere else right now. That's for sure.
And look, and Chris, we are also always constantly trying to improve it, right? We're always, thinking about, hey, how can we make this, better, more usable, more manageable, make it a platform for the entire ecosystem, right?
Right.
Hey, so KubeCon, one final thing though.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's KubeCon specific, Chris.
Okay.
But it's just dealing with virtual events.
Oh boy.
Right? We had Red Hat Summit.
Yeah.
We've had now 2 KubeCons. AWS is, I don't know, running a marathon of like an event.
3 weeks or
right?
something, reInvent.
Yeah. So look, clearly no right or wrong answer. Many answers. But oh my gosh, right? I don't know about you, but I'm guessing most people get Zoom fatigue or dealing with that. How do you kind of show up for these things? How do you interact with people? With some people, if English is not your native language, right? Are you
just
comfortable?
Makes the barrier to entry harder. Yeah.
And so I don't have a solution, to that, but especially events like KubeCon, I guess now AWS reInvent, right? Which is, if you got whatever 50,000 people, whatever the numbers are, right? That are showing up for these. Dreamforce, right, is another one that we're
right. Good point. Yeah.
How do you still keep that connection? How do you keep the hallway track? How do you?
So I think with KubeCon, they use the same platform we use for Summit, and for what it is, it's a virtual event platform. I think they did a better job. They, being CNCF, did a better job of this event because they realized there was a need for a hallway track. So they did create in the CNCF Slack a hallway channel. There was various Zooms going on. There was a lot of like Rambly and Gather Towns, these little like, platform games where you could kind of interact, audibly. I think that helped out a lot of folks. I think it helped folks learn and get access to people that they would not have otherwise. But there's no silver bullet for the virtual event thing, right? Because you deal with time zones, you deal with people's schedules, you deal with the fact that, okay, your employer is going to send you to a conference. Like you're not leaving your desk, right? Like the employer has to get value out of the conference, just like the attendee does, right? Like, and the events have to show that value to both, right? Like, please allow your folks to come to an event. If otherwise, you're not going to get any bang for your buck, right? And sure, you're spending $75, $100 on a KubeCon ticket, but if you let that person attend the events or the sessions that they need to go to answer the questions that they have now, that's free knowledge, right? Like,
Right.
yeah, you paid a small price for entry, but that's a very low price to a very high amount of knowledge that you're getting access to. And I think
Yeah.
that's the value proposition of the virtual events. Say what you will about the various platforms and everything, but yeah, like we need to understand that a back channel hallway track needs to exist. We've got to understand that folks need a way to interact at the very least audibly, preferably like we are face to face,
Yeah.
in a Zoom session right now. And others are watching us, through various streaming services, and thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it. But yeah, like that's the thing is we have to show value. We have to decrease friction, right? And show the world that you can do a virtual event in small chunks, right? Because that's pretty much how people consume things. It's either they're binging it on a Friday night or they're watching it in a 30-minute block at lunch, or it's a very wide spectrum of how people consume content, and it's usually one or the other. You don't get people in between, right? Like you get the binge watchers or you get the people that watch it live kind of deal. And we need to cater to both personality types, I feel like, and cater to the employers that are sending their people, right? We've got to show value in what their employees are going to get by attending that conference. So
Yeah, look, I mean, the flip side of this, of course, is that it democratizes
yeah.
participation,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because there's so many people who could normally not engage in or participate in events like this, right? Because of
Absolutely.
travel, expense, whatever it is, right? And so, on the positive side, right? I think that's a huge benefit. I hope we stay with that,
Right.
right, going forward. Even if
Mm-hmm.
you have some in person, it'd be great just to have this virtual capability, right, for all the people who couldn't make it
Exactly. Yeah.
in person. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there's got to be some balance that we should be able to strike now
Yeah,
between.
we
Yeah,
have the technology, right?
yeah, yeah,
Like,
right,
yeah, we just got to figure it out as humans what the
yeah,
the right way to assemble it is.
yeah,
So my last question, right? And you mentioned democratization. I think that's great. Like Kubernetes, like democratizes compute in ways we never really envisioned.
yeah.
How are we making sure that OpenShift helps bring value to organizations both large and small, right? Like there's a lot of capability in OpenShift. How do we make sure that our customers are happy, right? Like what are we doing? And I know this. I know the answer to the question, right? Like I know that there's tons of teams involved in selecting, the right technology to solve the problem, but the problems still have to bubble up, right? And customers bubble them up in various ways. We've had problems bubble up on this channel before, right? And answered them many times. So, it's, you're essentially the person in charge of how we go down this trail of things, that need to go into OpenShift. For those that aren't familiar, it's the Cloud Native Trail Map, which essentially details 10 things, one of which is container runtimes. That you're going to need to choose to have a good cloud native platform, and OpenShift makes a lot of those choices for you. It's an opinionated thing, but it's also all built on open source, so there's a lot of opportunity out there to just add on, right? Like, and now with CRDs and everything else, like what is it like to have to make some of these hard decisions? Sometimes a decision is not going to make a customer happy, and sometimes you have to make that decision, you personally. What is that like, right? Like we've democratized compute so much, but yet there's still some, we have to choose between, this runtime and that runtime, or this GitOps tool and that GitOps tool. Like at some point in time, we have to make a decision, and oftentimes it's, someone inside the org makes the decision, and I think you have to stamp it with the seal of approval at times. How do we go about that decision making process? How do we make sure that we're not going in the wrong direction, right? Like, what is that like?
Yeah, this is, well, it's a tough one to close on, Chris, because um, you often don't know if it's the right or the wrong decision until it's almost too late,
Right.
right? Um, there's a famous line that I think it's Jeff Bezos or someone who says this. Says, I think it's him. He gets on a conference call and has some blowout adoption of some area they've invested in, and financial analysts are congratulating him. And he's like, "Wow, you guys congratulated me today. You should have congratulated me 3 years ago when I made the decision to go down this path."
Right.
Because we're here today because of what we all decided as a group, back then.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
so there's that notion of you make a decision, right? It germinates, it gets to a point, and then you hope it's the right one for whatever period of time, right? 6, 12, 18 months down the line.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a little bit of a leap of faith, right, that we take based on the available information that we have and our prediction for the future, if you will. So sometimes you've got to have what I'll call strong opinions weakly held, right?
Yes.
Or
best
disagree and
phrase
commit,
ever. Yeah.
right? Because and even when it comes to our products, right? Hey, to your point, right? We'll give you an opinionated path, but at the same time, if you don't like our opinion, we should be able to at least allow for some change in that for you to say,
yes,
use Jenkins instead of Tecton, right? It's fine with us, or we give you source to image, but if you've got your own way of doing it, right, we're happy to support you on that, or any one of these, right? I'm sure Istio will be another one, right? We're like, oh, I'm using this, or something else for service mesh. So all of these, right? There's a balance to be had between the integrated experience that we want to give you, and then the amount of integration that we allow or enable, right, for you to be able to plug in to that, right? And I think Kubernetes, its community is sort of pretty good about whatever. The CSI or CNI, just other ways to kind of keep extending out to plug it in. I look at operators actually as giving you a bunch of different opinions or alternatives to things, right? So we think a lot about that, right, to ensure that we're making decisions that allow for those paths to continue sort of being opened up. So while we're making some choices for you, other places we're giving you enough flexibility for you to make your own choices or to replace one of our choices with your own. And then added to that, right, is just trying to be super customer centric. I mean, this, Chris, within our group, right? I mean, we take our sort of attention to customers really highly, right? It's something that we spend a lot of time on as a group, and then being able to just share some really cool stories that are out there. Like for me, the latest one that is fascinating to me is this one with this company based out of Latin America. It's this financial services group, got a digital banking license for Spain. And they went from conceiving the idea of building this digital bank to actually, planning and design all the way to prod and bringing a checking account to market in 4 months, right? And put that out on Openshift. So to me, that's amazing, right? And now, being able to go and say, now we're going to add additional, products and services, increasing their developer productivity, being able to roll out services faster. Now they're saying we're going to take advantage of a hybrid cloud, run some stuff in a data center, run some other things that they want to on a public cloud. I mean, a lot of new opportunities kind of open up for them.
Absolutely.
But, almost to go from a standing start to, sort of a business that in the past we'd be like, oh my gosh, that's a super regulated, stodgy business, right, is incredible. So being able to kind of get that kind of feedback from those customers who are doing these, really sort of, to our earliest point, Chris, these things that are fundamentally advancing their own mission, their own cause, the value that they're trying to provide, getting feedback from them, and then continually sort of, improving our product. I think that can only just lead to good outcomes all around.
Absolutely. Well, we're out of time today, sir. I really appreciate you coming on. I really appreciate everybody out there watching. Thank you so much, Ashesh. This has been an enlightening conversation. So I'm hopeful that our users can watch this in the future and kind of understand where we've been and where we're going, and that we have their best interest at heart. Is there anything you want to say, kind of parting word wise, to everybody out there watching?
No, I just want to say thank you, Chris, and obviously to everyone else watching. Chris, you're doing a remarkable job with this, right? We talked about democratization earlier, right? You're doing the same thing here, right, with Openshift TV, right? Sort of bringing it out as far out as possible, sort of creating a great amount of interactivity and collaboration. And what better time than now to
Right.
be doing this, right? So
Exactly. Yeah.
thank you, Chris, and
No,
thanks
thank
to
you.
everyone else. Yeah,
Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Uh, thank you everyone for watching. In 2 weeks, we will have the very famous Matt Hicks on. So stay tuned for that. But coming up next is Dev Nation. So I'm going to say goodbye here and let Dev Nation take the airwaves. And y'all have a great day and stay safe out there, everybody.
super. Thanks.